Good evening, everyone. Can you all hear me? Yes? Put your hands up at the back if you can hear me. Thank you. Brilliant. Well, my name's Susan Murray, and I am absolutely delighted to be here today to welcome you to this evening's lecture. I am the new director of the David Hume Institute, and this is the first event in my tenure. So this is my second week as director, so I'm really, really pleased to be welcoming you all tonight. Also in the room is Sarah. Sarah's going to be clicking on the other screen because we haven't got the technological link. Sarah, do you just want to wave and say hello? So if you have any questions about the David Hume Institute, Sarah or I will endeavour to answer them. And also at the front desk, we have borrowed Esther from the National Records of Scotland tonight, so she brought the extra handout on Scotland's population. So Esther's volunteering with us tonight to help out. Just before we start, a little housekeeping. If there is a fire alarm, it's not scheduled, so please do get up and move swiftly. There is a fire exit just to the side of the stage there, or behind you from the door you came in. The David Hume Institute brings you tonight events, and it's Exploring Scotland's Population, which continues the themes from our report, which we published in September, called Who Will Do the Jobs. We have 2 speakers that are lined up. Each will talk for about 25 minutes, and there will be time for questions and discussion afterwards. And then after the formal bit, we'll have time for informal drinks and discussions further over a drink, which will be served in the corner. So first up is Professor Michael Anderson. Mike is the Emeritus Professor of Economic History at the University of Edinburgh, and he's expert on Scottish demography. Last year, his book was published called Scotland's Population from 1850 to today. It was published by Oxford University Press. Followed by Mike, we will have Professor Graeme Roy. Graeme is the director of the Fraser of Allender Institute and head of economics at the University of Strathclyde. Prior to joining Strathclyde University, he was head of the First Minister's Policy Unit. So I will do a quick change of slides in between the two, but I won't come up and introduce Graeme. I'll just let you two hand over between the two of you. There is a hashtag for anyone tonight that wants to tweet, so people online can follow the conversation, and it's the hashtag we used in September, so we're continuing that. So Who Will Do the Jobs is the hashtag for tonight's event. So please join me in welcoming Mike to the podium.
Thank you, Susan. I shall have to be careful on this stage that I don't step off the back. You may not be able to see, but there is a hole at the back. Anyway, what fascinates me about demography is that what happens to a population in one period will have effects which will go on for 50 years or indeed sometimes from generation to generation. It's not something most of it you can't change quickly. Except for the fact that every so often something will happen that will produce a sudden little surge or a sudden little crash, and that may also then go on for a considerable period of time. So Scotland's populations, using the past to inform the present. Graeme is going to talk about the present. My role is to talk essentially about how we got here. So we start in 2018. I could have given you the 2019 figures if I had had them from Esther before I arrived. The 2018 population, about approaching 5.5 million, up in only 20 years from not much over 5 million. Those are the national figures. But one of the key things about Scotland's population, and in fact, my book is called Scotland's Populations, is the huge diversity in different parts of the country. What happens nationally is discrete to some extent from what happens in other countries, but within that there are a whole series of different trends. And just to illustrate, there you are, multiple Scotlands. That's Scotland's population density in 2001. The dark colours are more than 80 people per square kilometre. The light ones, the almost white ones, are less than 5. And it's very much the pattern that we are familiar with the Central Belt, a big clustering around the northeast, particularly Aberdeen, and then some clusterings across the borders, including, for example, the textile areas, and then odd, scattered towns scattered around around the country. That's 2001, just to show how, in some ways, things take a long time to change. That's 1801. In 1801, well, here's still the central belt. It's not quite as dense or quite as big, but basically it's already there. The northeast, you can't actually pick out Aberdeen in quite the same way, but Aberdeen is already showing up. The borders looking very similar, except for the fact that that textile area isn't there at that point. And, of course, the big empty Scotland. Or rather, the empty Scotlands. Because in all the discussion about the problems of clearances and the problems of the Highlands and Islands, what tends to get forgotten is the borders. And this bit, cleared early. In fact, none of this was ever particularly intensely populated. There were odd little bits, like Strathneva, very fertile, like Alva for a short period of time. But basically, most of it's empty, and we know why it's empty. Who on earth would live in the middle of Barvas Moor? So basically, that's the pattern. And perhaps the most important thing to take away from this is that the population declines in this area, but not actually all that much. But the populations decline more in the borders than they do up here. So let's come now and have a look at those national. Let's start looking at those national populations. I just want you, though, to bear in mind that underlying all this, there is considerable diversity. And one of the long-standing features of Scotland's population was its very unbalanced age structure. And here we are. This is 2016. The blue line is Scotland. The red line is England and Wales. And the numbers down that side are actually real numbers. Ignore the key, which multiplies them by 1,000. But England is multiplied by 10. And you superimpose them on top of each other, and you get quite an interesting pattern. And this is the problem that Graeme will be talking about, so I don't want to pick this up in any detail. But there, for example, are the baby boomers who will retire. There's the slump following the baby boomers. Here is an interesting bump, followed by virtually a big collapse in the number of people in each age group. And notice that the Scottish pattern fluctuates more than the England and Wales one. Now, that's the that's that pattern which we certainly will want to come back to. But that pattern has emerged following from 100 and more years of stuttering growth, with, as we shall see in a minute, big contrasts between different parts of the country. And that shows the population from 1850 to 2010, 2011, for a number of European countries. It's on a semi-logarithmic scale, so basically the angle of slope, as most of you, all of you I hope will realize, the angle of slope is controlled for, as it controls for the size of the population. Otherwise, England at the top here would be out somewhere through the roof also, so it has a second advantage. But basically, the steeper the slope, the faster the growth. This is England. Goes up about 3 times. Fast over the second half of the 19th century, that's 1910 there. Slows down and then goes quite fast there. This blue line down here is Scotland. Not rising by even twice. Same sort of pattern in the 19th century, but much slower. Then, particularly from the First World War onwards, slowing up, actually declines in the 1920s, declines again from the 1970s right through to 2000, has a little bump at the end, but nothing like the England and Wales. That pattern is unique after 1950 it's unique in Western Europe. The only countries which had a smaller population in 2001 than in 1951 were Hungary, Latvia, and Estonia. Everywhere else had a population that rose, and as you can see, the rest of these are Wales down here, which looked a bit like Scotland, but certainly grew over that part. Ireland, which is there, that's the post-famine Ireland, and this is the rapid growth thereafter. And otherwise, we've got Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Belgium, and this extraordinary pattern here is the Netherlands, where the population grew more than 5 times. So basically, Scotland grew slowly. And you can see this now reflected. This is the 1980s regions of Scotland, reconstituted backwards and forwards. And what it shows you, what it shows you at the bottom here is that the population of the Highlands and Islands doesn't change very much over time. It's about 50,000 lower here than it was there. The population of the south of Scotland, that's Borders and Dumfries and Galloway, is pretty similar. Tayside, that's Dundee and textiles. Otherwise, not much change. Grampian, that's fishing. And this is oil. This is coal. And that is also coal. And this is Strathclyde. Grew effectively roughly twice between 1851 and 1911. And then flattened off, and from the 1960s actually went into decline. It's the only major staple industry region in Western Europe where the population declines like that. Strathclyde has a unique kind of pattern in Western Europe, and it's Glasgow, but it's actually more than Glasgow. There's out-migration starting already in some of that area in the 1860s, and Glasgow had out-migration continuously from the 1880s onwards. And then finally, this is Lothian. Most of that actually is coal mining, and then here, Lothian being a bit dynamic. But if you compare any one of those regions with a comparable region in England, you will find that they are growing more slowly. The rural ones grow more slowly. The industrial ones certainly do no better. And of course, London and the southeast looks completely different from what goes on, for example, in the nearest comparator, which would be Lothian. So how did we get here? How did we get here? Well, we got here through changes in the 3 components of population change. And first is birth rates, which were internationally high until the 1960s. Scotland was interesting. It had low marriage rates, but high marital fertility in particularly the Central Belt and those sorts of areas. Fertility, well, here it is. The top ones here, this is birth rates. And the red is England and Wales, and the blue is Scotland. And you can see down it comes. England and Wales falls much faster. This here is the 1930s. This is the post-war baby boom. This is the 1950s. This is the boom years of the around 1960. And this is the crash that took place from about 1970 onwards. Recession, the pill, a bit of abortion, and mothers starting to delay childbearing as well. And then, about 1970, the Scottish birth rate falls below the England and Wales birth rate. And over time, that gap widens. Even when they go up, the gap is still there. So basically, that is what is happening to births. And if we now look, deaths, Scotland's death rate has been internationally high, since the 1960s, but actually it goes back far, far further than that. At all ages other than 0, the Scottish age-specific death rates were higher than England and Wales from the 1860s. The national birth rate only stayed, here it is, the national birth rate only stayed roughly the same as England and Wales because until the 1890s, infant mortality was, strangely enough, we don't understand why, lower. Thereafter, the England and Wales death rate is always below the Scottish. And that gap widens markedly in the late 1890s and the early 21st century, 1990s, the early 21st century. And indeed, there is a period of time when the Scottish death rate rises above the Scottish birth rate. Now, if we look at this graph, we've got here a big graph between births and deaths. Here it's smaller, here it almost disappears. Natural increase, then, has been very high in both countries initially, declined and even indeed went negative in the 1990s. Now, this is natural increase and net migration, and this is natural increase is the top. This is the difference between births and deaths. And the figures, it starts from 1861 up to 2011. And broadly speaking, you can treat these as if they were percentages. And that's 14% there. So in the 19th century, up until 1911, these are by decades, up until then, you've got a situation where there's a big gap. And there's a big gap roughly in both countries. In the interwar period, there's still a gap, but it's declining quite markedly. It's down to 5 to 6%, and Scottish birth rates are significantly higher than those of England and Wales. And then, from 1970 onwards, the Scottish birth rate in particular virtually disappears, and natural increase effectively disappears altogether. In fact, it goes negative between 2001 and 2011. So, particularly in this period, Scottish natural increase is far higher than England and Wales. There's only one possible interpretation for that, and that is that net migration is markedly different. And indeed, here it is, Scotland, fluctuating but persistently high net outflow. And it goes right back. Here we are. These are the ladders underneath. And broadly speaking, this is the 1860s, net out migration 4%. Here's 1881 to 1891, 1901 to 1911. It's around 6%. More men emigrated in the 5 years before the First World War than were killed in the First World War. That is a fairly interesting statistic, I always think. This is the 1920s when it reaches 8%. These are the ones that are really interesting. This is the 1950s and 1960s. There's the new Commonwealth immigration in England and Wales. And this is the huge net outflow going on in Scotland. Okay. And then, even when Scottish net migration goes positive, it goes less positive than those of England and Wales. Okay. Net migration, then, is nearly always negative, and Scotland has one of the highest net migration rates, decade by decade, anywhere in Western Europe, other than Ireland, right back from the 1860s onwards. But didn't mean that Scotland didn't have immigration. In fact, immigrants as percentage of the population, if we include people from the rest of the UK, Scotland persistently has actually a higher percentage of its population as immigrants than does England and Wales. But there's a different balance. I suppose we all are vaguely at least aware of this. Many more from the rest of the United Kingdom, many fewer from overseas. Let's take England and Wales over here. These two columns here are 1991 and 2001. The solid is migration from Ireland. These are the rest of these are actually from Scotland, and that is overseas immigration. Very, very marked. But look, over here, this is Scotland. and look, okay, Ireland, this is England and Wales, up quite markedly in this period, and this is the new immigration of the first decade of the 21st century. That, as we shall see in a minute, is very important. But net overseas migration is a very, unstable and often very vulnerable, to sudden rapid change. That's net overseas migration in Scotland from 1950 to 2015. Jumps around hugely. Now, this is partly an estimation issue, but it jumps around hugely. But look at this. That's 2015, 2014, 2013, 2012, 2011, 2008. It does this. It's highly vulnerable, highly fluctuating, and is something that I think we must never ignore. So, that's the components. Each of these trends then contributes to our current unbalanced age structure. And that's the graph I started with. This is the graph in a different form that you'll see from Graeme later on. But let's look and see what happens if we go back in time. Now, that's 1911. The bumps are because people were still rounding their ages. They didn't know how old they were. But don't worry about that. This is the very small number of old people. This is high mortality, and also a very young age structure. The flatness of it, though, is also partly produced by the very high rates of emigration, particularly of young men. That gap there between women, the dotted line, and men, the solid line, is entirely the result of emigration in the past 20 years. That's 1911. That's 1951. That starts to look more like the present, with some big and rather interesting bumps in it. Now, this is people not born during the war. This is people born in 1921, after the war. This is the very flat interwar period, and that's my immediately post-war birth rate boom. And this one then carries that forward to 2001. And here we are in 2001. There's the people born in 1947. There's the big boom that we saw when we looked at fertility in 1965. This is the slump in fertility to 1947, and this is the subsequent low levels and indeed declining levels of birth rate. By the time you get to there, you have about half the number, not much more than half the number of babies that we had when you go back there to 1911. So, but there's something interesting about that. That is then followed by that. But if we go to here, that is followed by that. So, what's going on? This lot here is immigration. What I did here is project forward the 2001 population by 15 years. That's what it would have looked like if we simply had taken the 2001 population and projected it forward. That is what it actually looks like today. It's not that people didn't immigrate, come in the past. It's just that most of them were students or young people, and they left again. What has happened here is more students, but above all, they have stayed. But remember my graph of vulnerability of migration? over to Graeme to tell us whether or not he thinks they are going to stay. And if you want to follow this more, some of it is in my book, which is there. And notice Scotland's populations. It is a book which makes comparisons in all sorts of directions.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the opportunity to come along and speak with you this evening. As Michael said, I want to take some of the issues that he has raised, but look forward and look to where Scotland's population might head, some of the economic implications of that. And if you don't mind, I'll stray a wee bit into some of the policy implications and opportunities for Scotland to finish with. A couple of comments just to start. I mean, I was struck by chatting to Michael before this evening about a couple of kind of key themes that come out from the work that he's just talked about already. So firstly, just how much today's population is shaped by long-term structures in our population that are very difficult to turn around and shift, and changes that have been decades in the making. Secondly, the structure of our population, including the migration patterns that he highlights there, where people live and work, has been shaped by economics. And of course, Scotland's population has in turn greatly shaped the economy of this country. And then thirdly, when we talk about Scotland's changing demography and some of the challenges that we face as a country, and also some of the opportunities, we do ignore often the major differences that exist within Scotland, much in the way that Scotland's economy is far from homogenous, then so is our population. Now, all of these kind of set up the backdrop for my remarks tonight and the crucial implications it has for policy. So while Malcolm has talked about how we got here, I'd like to focus on where we go next. And last month, we had the latest assessment from the National Records of Scotland about where Scotland's population might be heading. I think a number of points I would just like to highlight and to talk you through. So firstly, the figures confirm that while Scotland's population is projected to grow over the next 25 years, from around, as Michael said, 5.4, just over 5.4 million to 5.6 million, that pace of growth is projected to slow and then to level off. Secondly, our population will continue to age. Our age profile, as Michael says, currently got a large peak around about 70. So the baby boomers, if you actually push that forward, you can actually see these bulges shifting through to have an ever-increasing aging population. In 2001, the median average age in Scotland was 39. By 2017, that had risen to 42. And in 20 years' time, that will rise to about 45. Our current age profile, has that peak there at the age of 70. But again, if you think about it, the children of that baby boomers are now not that far off retirement. Some may be in the fortunate position of already being in retirement, but the rest are rapidly catching up with them. Now, changes to the state pension age will help in the short term protect Scotland's working age population, but in time that will start to fall back. So these are the projections for Scotland's working age population. So initially, from 2018, we'll start to see some modest increases, largely driven by the changes in state pension age, extending the working age lifetime. But over time, that will start to slip back, and our working age population will start to decline from where it is at the moment. Thirdly, Scotland's got these challenges, but we're not unique in facing these challenges. The latest projections for Scotland in a European context actually put Scotland pretty much at the EU average for the changes in our population over the next 25 years. So there's Scotland there, 2.5% growth projected in our population for the next 25 years, spot on with the EU 28. And what's quite interesting is just if you look at the spread, the significant variation in Europe about what might happen to populations. So when we talk about the challenge we've got in Scotland, if you were to go to have a talk somewhere in Italy or Portugal or Croatia, you would see actually even a more significant, even more important challenge coming down the line. One of the things that's quite interesting is the position for the UK as a whole. And one of the issues for Scotland is that actually the UK is actually a bit of an outlier in the projections for what might happen to population over the next few decades. So as I said, Scotland's population projected to rise by about 2.5%. Over the next 25 years, the UK population is projected to rise by around 9%. So in thinking about the whole political debates and the importance of migration, potentially to the economy, it's not hard to see the significant differences that exist between issues about what implications might be at a UK level from a Scotland level when you have quite significant differences in how and where our populations might head. And this is particularly important when you look at the implications for working age population. So if you look over the next 25 years, Scotland's working age population, based on current trends, is projected to basically remain flat, if not fall ever so slightly. But in England, it's closer to rise by about 8%. So really quite significant variations between what's happening in terms of the working population within Scotland and also in the rest of the UK. Obviously, Wales in a slightly more challenging position than us, but the key driver in UK migration being what's happening at the UK level. Now, you might argue that the people who do population projections have just about as good a track record at forecasting as we economists do. That'd be slightly unfair. I think they are better than us. But I think what's quite important is to separate out the different elements to understand what's driving these numbers. And Michael's already touched on the importance of the distinction between natural change and the migration element. Now, on the one hand, fertility and mortality rates are relatively stable, and we can actually be predicted a relatively long time in advance with quite a degree of confidence. And they are driven by the dynamics that Michael has so eloquently set out. And on the other hand, we have the migration flows, which are much less easy to predict and much more volatile. So what do we know in all of these? So as Michael said, this natural change has been coming down to be very close between deaths and births in Scotland. Actually, the most recent data suggests that in 2018, the number of deaths in Scotland exceeded births by around 8,000. The most recent projections from the NRS think that over the next few decades, that will rise to closer to 20,000. So the gap between deaths and births, so actually Scotland's natural change in the population will start to decline. Now, of course, there's policy actions you can do to try and tackle some of that. So obviously things around trying to boost fertility rates, support families, support more people to remain active in the workforce. But I guess the key point is the scale of that shift that we know is coming means that it's really only likely to have an impact at the margins. We have high levels of employment, high levels of participation. Your ability to turn around and make the structural changes you need in order to cope with such a change, a natural change in your population, is only ever likely to have an impact in the small scale. So that means that migration becomes absolutely crucial for Scotland in that context. And without migration to counterbalance that squeeze on our natural population over the next few decades, and Scotland's population will decline. And building on the long-term averages, you look at the average over the since mid-2001 to mid-2018, the average net migration into Scotland's been around about 20,000, so just enough to cope with that pressure on the overall squeeze on our natural rate of population. So migration is absolutely crucial. It is the pivot point on what will happen to Scotland's population over the medium to long term. And of course, what really matters is not just migration in terms of Scotland's total population, but also in terms of what happens to the working age population. So if you look at, the potential projections for what might happen to population, any change in migration will have a disproportionate impact upon the outlook for Scotland's working age population. So again, these are latest projections looking at variations about what might happen, or not what might happen, but what would happen if you had different rates of migration between Scotland, coming into Scotland from the EU. Again, to put that roughly in context, if you were to have a 50% decline in EU migration based upon the projections we have as our central forecast, you're talking about Scotland's working age population declining from minus 0.2%, so pretty flat, down to a 2% fall in our working age population over the next 25 years. And if you have net zero migration from the EU over the next 25 years, that number would fall to closer to a 4% decline in Scotland's working age population. And what's really important, though, is not just the figure for Scotland, but how it contrasts with the figure for the rest of the UK. So on those charts, the UK can cope with a declining migration from the European Union or declining overseas net migration because its working population is still projected to grow because of the long-term trends that Michael set out about the natural performance of the UK's population base. Scotland doesn't have that luxury. Any declines in migration from current projected levels will mean that it will have a disproportionate effect on our working age population, and that in turn will have significant implications for our economy. And of course, as Michael said, it doesn't take much for such numbers to change quite significantly. They're already quite volatile, but any change to the economic outlook, any change to the policy outlook can have a significant impact at the margin and then have a disproportionate impact upon Scotland's stable rate of population. And of course, it's not just about what happens here. So the charts I was showing you about some of the major challenges that Eastern European countries have in terms of population ageing mean that actually what's happening in where we've got our migrants from recently in the past, the origin country, the outlook for these countries will also be changing quite significantly. So our opportunity to attract new migrants will be potentially slightly more difficult. So that's a picture at a national level. But as Michael mentioned, the picture within Scotland is extremely varied. As I mentioned, the average age in Scotland is 42 today. In Dumfries and Galloway and the Western Isles, it's 49. In Glasgow, Edinburgh and Aberdeen, so large cities with strong student populations, it's in the mid 30s. And I guess one of the really interesting things is, just building on Michael's point there, is a significant variation that exists across Scotland in terms of the age profile of the population. And we know that's likely to have not just significant implications for the economy, but really serious implications for the future of public service delivery and the cost of delivering public services in particular areas, particularly on local authorities around social care and the future of that. It's also quite interesting as well about the differences that exist between rural and urban areas. So again, looking at some of the more rural areas, Dumfries and Galloway or Gowland and Bute, really quite significant, older populations there at the moment and the potential challenges that will bring. Now, one of the things that's quite interesting is that if you look at the age profiles of certain local authorities in certain regions of Scotland, not only is a wide variation in the level of the average age, but the pace of aging. So this chart here, bear with me, it's slightly complicated. But on the horizontal axis, I've got the median age of local authorities in 2001. So as you move along that axis, your average age increases. So it starts off at 35 and goes along to 44 at the end. On the left-hand side there, we've calculated the percentage change in age, median age, between 2001 and 2017. Okay? So basically, if you're in the top right-hand corner, you started with an older population, and you've had an increase in average age in your population. And the further up you are, the older your population was to start with, and the faster the pace and growth of that aged population over that time period. If you're down in the bottom left corner, so Glasgow, Edinburgh, Aberdeen, Dundee, not only did you start off with a younger population, in those instances, your average age of your population has actually gone down. So the variation within Scotland, where you have parts of the country which are younger and actually are potentially getting younger, versus parts of the country which are older and actually are aging more quickly than the Scottish average. So that disproportionate impact of population on a regional basis is actually increasing and accelerating and becoming ever more significant. And that poses a challenge, particularly for some of these communities, particularly rural communities, where you have a cycle of fewer young people, leading to shrinking populations, leading to smaller economies, leading to less migration, leading to fewer young people, leading to a slower economy, and it builds up a cycle there, which is a difficult one for many economies to get out of. So what does all this mean for the economy and our public finances? Well, understanding the dynamics of how economy grow is actually really straightforward. Economists just make it complicated, but it's actually pretty straightforward. There are actually only a small number of ways that our economy can grow. By expanding our land and stock of capital, growing our active labour force, or boosting productivity. Now, unless Mr. Mackay has secret plans to invade Northumberland, then I think we can probably park that one as a strategy for boosting our economy. But ultimately, the way an advanced economy like Scotland can expect to grow over time is through its labour force, its investment and productivity. Now, the demographic changes that Michael touched on will have profound effects for all three of these elements, both nationally and regionally. So if you take the labour force to start with, so any decline in the economically active population has two significant implications. So firstly, by curtailing the size of the population, that acts to reduce aggregate supply in our economy. That pushes up costs and reduces competitiveness. And this shrinks our long-term growth performance. Secondly, a declining population, again, particularly of working age, can impact the demand side of our economy. With fewer people spending money, this acts as a brake on growth. Now, some of this stems from weaker private sector demand, but also weaker public sector growth. Tax revenues will be squeezed, with fewer people paying tax and crucially not paying as much tax as they may have done in the past. So as a result, if the economically active population shrinks, the implications for our economy can be quite serious. Now, to illustrate that, we've been playing around with our modelling to show the potential impact of a reduction in migration over the long term. So we've used our big macro model of the Scottish economy, and it's the one that we've developed with the Scottish Policy Foundation, which crucially includes the new fiscal framework for Scotland, which I'll come back to at the end. So what we've done is just to illustrate this is we've looked at the long-term implications of moving from the central projection for migration that the NRS use to the low migration scenario. And this would see net international migration moving from around about 9,500 to 5,000 a year. And to put that in context, that's pretty much in line with a near freeze in EU net migration, or based on past trends, this would be roughly the type of number that Scotland may expect to get if UK net migration was to go below 100,000. Who would have thought that would have been a totemic number? If this was to occur, we'd be talking about a hit to GDP in Scotland of the long run of about 2%, around 2.5 billion, broadly comparable hit to GDP on a per head basis. Employment would fall by about 2% or 1.6%, while real household consumption, a measure of overall welfare, would fall by around 1%, and Scottish Government budget would be squeezed. And that's from a relatively small change in net migration, feeding through to the working age population, and over time leading to a smaller and more fragile economy than otherwise we would have had. Now, importantly, this is just simply from shrinking the economically active proportion in our economy. So there's no adjustment has been made for the higher than average skill level that many migrants have, and nothing to do about the higher participation rates that migrants have in our economy. It's simply from shrinking the economically active proportion in our economy. Of course, within sectors, it will vary significantly. So we know that some sectors are particularly more dependent upon EU migration or into overseas migration in other parts, whether that be tourism, agriculture, academia, or a number of our key export markets that we have in Scotland. So the importance of a sustainable migration level to Scotland can't be overstated. Now, I don't really want to stray in too much into the migration debate tonight, but I guess the key point from that is that any decision or any policy objective to limit migration, into Scotland, either indirectly or directly, will have significant negative implications for our economy over the long run. So that's what happens in terms of market size. In terms of the labour market, obviously there's some really interesting questions that economists are beginning to think about what happens to productivity with an ageing population. On the one hand, some theories suggest that if you believe that people save and invest over their lifetime, as people get older, then they're going to be less likely to have savings, which in turn might squeeze investment. So people save when they're younger and then cash in these investments as they're over. But the evidence actually on whether this occurs is so far relatively mixed. Studies have also tested for a link between innovation and age. And what they tend to find is some tentative evidence that innovation is higher the younger you are, particularly around, potentially in your 30s and 40s. That's when you tend to be your most innovation active. Some research has also tested for links between skill shortages. So as you move into retirement, whether these skill shortages in particular sectors can become a challenge, and does that act as a brake on growth? Another potential avenue is through the composition of spending. So we know that as you get older, the demand shifts towards more labour-intensive sectors like health and social care. And we also know that these sectors are some of the ones we face real challenges in trying to become more productive over the long run. And there's also, at an individual level, some evidence to suggest that your cognitive abilities reach a peak quite depressingly in your 20s and early 30s. So yes, we'll just move on quickly from that. But against that, education and experience tend to increase with age. Management and leadership abilities also tend to increase with age. So there's no knockout, I would argue there's no knockout argument either way about whether or not productivity is going to be harmed or boosted as our population gets older. And obviously as well as the changing structure of our population happens, so too will the incentives go. So my dad was always going to retire at 60, and everything was structured around retiring at 60. Sadly for me, it's probably likely to be 70 before I'll be able to retire. So that then will change your outlook and the decisions that you take. So what does all that mean for the public finances? Now one area we do know a bit more about is what might happen to the public finances. So first and foremost, the ageing of our population will increase the cost of public pensions, state pensions, and age-related benefits. To contrary to what you might think, such costs haven't been saved for. Public pensions are still always met out of current taxpayers. Now, interestingly, some of the responsibility for some elements that are now correlated with age will transfer to Holyrood in April. So from April, the Scottish Government will get responsibility for over £3 billion worth of social security payments. Significant number of these are highly correlated with age because they're related to health. Secondly, we also know that with fewer people paying tax, that will also add a new squeeze in terms of public sector revenue over time. But what's also quite interesting is not just the size of your population, but the age profile of your population is really crucial for what happens to tax. So this chart here shows average tax liability on a per capita basis by age. So as our population ages, all else remaining equal, and as we start to slide up into that higher age bracket, then the amount of tax revenue we're raising in Scotland will decline, and it will decline also in the UK as a whole. So this will add as a pressure and a squeeze on all countries' budgets, and particularly in Scotland. Now, interestingly, with the new fiscal framework for Scotland, the obvious question from that will be is whether or not Scotland is likely to be more or less impacted by these trends relative to the rest of the UK. And you might think that with an ageing population, that Scotland and Holyrood's budget will face an even more acute problem than it otherwise would have done. Somewhat surprisingly, though, is that whether or not the Scottish Government budget does better or worse with an ageing population, purely on the revenue side, is not exactly entirely clear-cut. Now, to understand this, we need to get into a bit of the dark arts about the fiscal framework. Now, I don't intend to do that in case John throws something at me tonight. But I just want to give you a kind of a rough, quick overview about why this might not be as bad as, at least on the demographics, as you may initially think in the first instance. So, why is that? Well, remember that the Scottish budget is now determined by two key elements. Firstly, the block grant that we get from Westminster, and secondly, this adjustment that now takes place to the block grant to compensate for the fact that we've now got these devolved revenues here in Scotland. So what we see then is that the budget is going to be determined by two key elements. One is what's happening to Barnet, and secondly, what's happening to the relative tax performance on a per head basis between Scotland and the rest of the UK. Now, on the one hand, if you've got a shrinking population with the Barnet formula, then the Barnet squeeze, the so-called Barnet squeeze that will limit Scotland's public expenditure advantage relative to the rest of the UK, actually slows down and may actually even go into the reverse. So actually a declining population in Scotland, faster than the rest of the UK, actually protects spending per head by the way the Barnett formula works. It sticks the Barnett formula convergence into reverse. But what about tax? Because tax now really matters, and how Scotland's relative performance might work is obviously going to be really crucial. Now, you might think at first glance that this is bad news, because if we've got a faster aging population than the rest of the UK, and more people moving into paying lower tax, that demographic thing could be bad news for Scotland. The slight curveball in all of that is that what matters is not just the people at the bottom, but the people at the early age groups as well. And interestingly, as Michael's touched on, and the latest projections show, the decline in Scotland's young population is faster than it is in the rest of the UK. So two things are happening. One is we've got more people aging, potentially going to be paying less tax. But we're going to have a lot fewer young people also paying less tax, and the two effects will cancel one another out. And actually, what we think over the next 10 years or so, purely looking on the basis of demographics and not about the implications of the economy, the way this fiscal framework works acts somewhat oddly to kind of somewhat protect Scotland's budget. One, on the Barnett squeeze being reduced, and secondly, because of the relative share of tax collected at different age groups, and because we've got a faster shrinking young population, purely in that demographic point, Scotland's budget is going to be relatively protected in all of that. So that's on the revenue side. Now, the bit where Scotland has got a much greater challenge and much greater issues to deal with that is obviously around what might be happening to public expenditure. And we know that as population ages, costs will rise with a greater proportion of the population requiring costly treatments, particularly in health and social care. And you see that there. This is the average cost of average health costs by age. And if we have more and more people shifting along there into that higher age demographics, then the average cost of just maintaining the health care of our population is going to rise simply by the fact that they're now aging. And actually, if you look at the latest numbers, the health budget has risen from about 37% of the Scottish budget in 1999, and it's not that far off 50%. So every £2 spent by the Scottish Government, £1 goes in the NHS. The Scottish Government actually estimates that it will need to increase spending by around about 3.5% per annum in real terms, simply to cope with the increased demand that's coming down the line from an ageing population and rising technology costs. Now, the government hoped to bring that down to about 2% over the next few years through efficiencies and reforms. But even then, 2% real growth in health spending every single year means that in the current growth climate, more and more of our economy, more and more of government budgets is going to be eaten up by increases in health spending. And actually, if you look at latest projections that we've done for Scotland, health spending will rise from around about 8% of our economy just now to closer to 15% over the next 50 years or so. And of course, it's not just in health where pressures will emerge, but also in wider areas such as health and social care. And interestingly, the OBR, even for the UK, estimate that total spending will need to rise from about 37% to about 45% of the economy in the long run. So that's where we are about where our economy is. Significant increases in long-term public spending coming through an ageing population. Contrary to what you might hear in general election debates, that can't all be funded from borrowing, at least not yet anyway. So just some final quick reflections on policy and where we go for Scotland in all of this. Clearly migration is important, and it's been debated elsewhere, and I don't intend to go into that in too much detail, but just to stress the importance of migration into Scotland around that pivot about what happens to our working age population. One of the things that we need to think about, though, is if we're advocating a divergence in migration targets for Scotland, because we believe they're important for Scotland relative to the rest of the UK, a strong argument also exists for differences within Scotland to cope with the significant challenges that exist on a regional basis and a local basis across the country. At the same time, the importance of attracting migrants from the rest of the UK shouldn't be ignored. So this is probably less about formal migration rules and formal migration targets, but much more about Scotland as an attractive place to live and work That means getting it right in all aspects of economic and social policy, from housing, business growth, planning, tax, and public services. On public spending, it seems inevitable that as a country, we can't put off frank discussions too much longer about what we prioritise and pay for as a society. Some of this will be difficult choices about what we can and can't afford, and about how much tax we're willing to pay in order to have the level of service that we want to have. But some of it will be about the reforms that we need to manage demand and make budgets more sustainable. And over the years, from the discussions about outcomes and prevention through to the Christie Commission, we have actually a really rich evidence base to inform what we should and need to be doing. There's a question about whether we're actually doing what we need to be doing. We know what we should be doing, but if you open up any manifesto for this general election, it's back to the old stuff about numbers of nurses, numbers of police officers, £1 billion spent in this budget, and that focus on outcomes is being crowded out. And to actually be successful in all of this, we really need a joined up approach, not just in health, social care, but all aspects of economic and social policy to target some of that. On the economy, we need to get much better at imagining genuine lifelong learning. So quite rightly, over the years, much of our focus has been on youth unemployment and how we can tackle the challenges of that. But as our population ages, reskilling, retraining, and focusing on how we can support workers through their entire lifetime is going to be really crucial. There's some great initiatives like developing Scotland's young workforce that have really transformed the outlook for young people. So what can we learn from that in the context of an older population, and what can we take forward into the years ahead? Some of it will be about encouraging more people into the labour force. So the investments in childcare obviously have a crucial role to play in all of this. And some of it about encouraging more fair work and supportive employment practices to encourage older workers to remain in the workforce for longer while continuing to support their well-being and opportunities. There remains still a massive inequality in outcomes for older workers. So if you're in a strong, stable job, earning a decent salary, the opportunities for you to continue to work as you age are much more than they are for people in much more unstable and much more fragile work. And we also need to be much more proactive about tackling some of these regional inequalities here. These regional inequalities are driven by economics. So narrowing that regional variation from an economic perspective for Scotland is going to be absolutely crucial. And the reason I put up there, déjà vu there, is that many of these issues have been discussed before. For those who've been along to previous David Hume Institutes over the last 15 to 20 years will no doubt recall some of these issues being raised and discussed extensively. I think what's perhaps different this time is that in the past, a lot of these issues were thinking about for the future and for tomorrow. But if you actually look about what's happening to people, entering retirement age, if you actually look about what's happened to Scotland's working age population today, if you look about what's happening to health budgets, local government budgets, it's happening now. The impacts of Scotland's ageing population and changing population are beginning to bite into our economy. And so we need to think about that. We need to move forward, and we actually need to turn the great knowledge we have about what we need to do and should be doing into action. So that's, some of it's about migration, but some of it's also about proactive policies to support fair work, encourage participation in the labour market, and to develop fair and robust and innovative work opportunities for people of all ages, and to improve levels of skill training and support. And on that basis, I'm happy to hand over to the Q&A part. Thank you.
So I am absolutely fascinated. A whole range of issues coming up there. I think Graeme has hit the nail on the head with the déjà vu. Many of us have heard these projections before. And I think the call to action there, Graeme, you gave us really strongly. I'm going to throw this straight open to questions rather than me kicking off with one of mine. And I have Sarah with a microphone coming to you there. I'll take one on this side as well. And so we'll have two together, and then the gentleman will answer them, and then we'll have another two.
Hi. I spotted some correlation in your slide, the previous speaker. And it was at the point where, as migration increased from overseas to England. There seems to be inflow migration from English people to Scotland. I just wanted to hear a little bit more about that. But I also, especially in terms of age, are there working populations that are moving from England to Scotland? I wanted to ask you about the models. So what are the chances that, because we know that after Brexit, UK is going to target again overseas migrants, and they're talking about point-based system like we have in Australia. So what are the chances that as the increases maybe spike up in terms of British overseas migrants from Commonwealth countries, what are the chances of people migrating from England to Scotland, whether it's migrants from overseas who choose to come to Scotland rather than stay in England? So those are the things I would like to clarify a bit.
Any more burning questions, or should we go straight to an answer? Straight to an answer, then.
Shall I start on that? Since it was my graph I think you were referring to. What actually happened in the years after 2000 was actually very interesting, because there was an increase in international migration. There was also a net inflow from people born in the UK, and a lot of that was actually people who, some of that was actually also people coming back. So you've actually got three processes going on. Actually, they were born in Scotland, but some of them are actually coming back. And that, they tended to be people who were, who had gone to London for their first jobs, and they then came back looking for a better standard of living, or they got fed up with the rat race or whatever. This is work that's been done particularly in the University of St Andrews and Dundee I'm referring to here. So that was that component. Of course, some of the English migration is actually quite a lot of that is students. And the interesting thing there, as with the international migrants, is actually people staying on. Rather than if you look at the pattern up to the very early years of the 21st century, you get a pattern where the migration flow looks like that from 18 to about 23, and then goes right down like that as they all go away again, the international migrants. It's now much flatter. And that's the reason. And it's both international migrants and people from England and Wales who have been staying, boosted also by people who are coming back from England and Wales to Scotland.
Yeah. So on the point about overseas migration and the potential what might happen post Brexit and the strategies that might go around that. So, if I can try and make sense of UK migration policy, I'll try my best. But it seems to be that it's driven by two objectives. One is to limit the total migration coming in, and secondly, to have migration to address skill shortages that might exist in the UK economy. Both of these are completely irrelevant for the Scottish context, because Scotland's objectives, as I showed you there, are around total. So we don't need a limit. Actually, Scotland needs migration to, as I showed you, the difference between working age population between England, but the rest of the UK and Scotland. Scotland needs volume of people, even before you have any conversations about skill shortages or anything like that. So that's the first point, where targets about limits on migration, if it is, or targets that are indirect targets to limits on migration, will potentially be damaging to Scotland. Secondly, any target that tries to do skill shortages or a points-based system, again, is designed to usually try and attract or encourage migrants who have a particularly higher level of skill or higher wage. Again, that's completely irrelevant from the Scottish context, because actually a lot of the sectors that we have that need migration actually will come nowhere near those levels of skill level, nowhere near these levels of income. So yes, we want highly skilled migrants, and yes, coming from a university sector, make a massive contribution there. But if you have a limit on if you have a limit in the total, that's bad news for Scotland. And if you have a limit or impositions on the types of migrants that come in, that's also bad news, particularly for some of our key sectors. So I think the point about extending it out to overseas migration, having a more managed system, if the managed system is designed to, quite rightly, hit an objective at the UK level, that might be appropriate at a UK level, but it's certainly not appropriate a Scottish level. And that's where I think the advocacy of having a distinct role potentially for Scottish migration and interest to be in there becomes absolutely crucial in that context.
Can I just follow that with another point? We talk, and the UK government tends to talk about the UK. And actually, we also talk about England. But actually, the migration patterns into London are totally different from those of the rest of the UK. And one of the arguments that the Migration Advisory Committee has used against doing anything special for Scotland is that actually there are some areas of England, particularly in the north, which they say are as bad. They're not actually as bad. They're not, but they are certainly more nearly bad than, for example, London and the southeast. But I think that part of the issue we've talked about, disaggregating Scotland, actually to understand these things really, and I've been having a bit of a look at this recently, you actually have to disaggregate England and Wales as well. And if you disaggregate England, you find all kinds of different patterns, and actually a simple limit on migration will not actually solve most of the English regional problems either. Might help the London problem, might help some of the other southeast problems, but it won't actually help, for example, very much the northeast or the northwest, or indeed even potentially the southwest.
Anyone interested in this subject, the last lecture we had was Jonathan Portis, who looked a lot at different types of effective targets in Scotland. We've got that available online if anyone's not heard that and wants to listen to it. One of the trends that's not been mentioned is people coming home to retire to Scotland after working elsewhere. And there are certain areas, particularly rural Perthshire around Crieff, that are being affected, are being massively affected in terms of local services and people retiring there. Are you seeing that in other areas of Scotland as well?
Oh, the Isle of Mull is the classic one. If I remember rightly, 30% of the population, the older population of the Isle of Mull, is actually born in England. It's some enormous figure. And that is going up. And why the Isle of Mull? It's 45 minutes in the ferry to Oban. It's completely different from almost any of the other islands. And you have a Marks and Spencer's, and you have an Aldi, and you have all sorts of other facilities. And that's completely different. So the aging pattern in Mull looks, for example, completely different to Islay or to Tiree, or indeed even the outer islands. Mull is a particular example.
Any more questions?
Well, I'm glad you've tackled the student question, because I wondered how 85,000 students in Edinburgh who are paying no council tax and living in their dedicated ghettos, as one of them was calling it to me, or roost, I think he said. I just wonder how that figures in terms of an economy in a city like Edinburgh. And I noticed all the students were clustered in the 4 cities at the bottom left of your chart, interestingly. But that's a transient population, even if some of them are staying.
Yeah.
And they are not paying council tax, as I say. So that's a question, really. But my concern is the type of economy that's being developed in Edinburgh now, which is heavily tourist dependent. And the chief executive of Mercure Hotels actually has said Edinburgh could be a catastrophe waiting to happen. Because if Mike Berners-Lee and people like that are right, and we slam up the cost of flights, this tap might be turned off a little bit. So we may end up with a lot of redundant hotels, and which are already suffering from Airbnb and so on. So could we, I mean, I know I'm sticking to Edinburgh on this, but it may apply elsewhere, I don't know. Is that model a little bit terrifying, potentially? A black swan, perhaps, waiting to fly in?
So a few things in that. I think I think you would struggle to make an argument that the net contribution of universities and students coming to Scotland was negative because of students not paying council tax. You may think I'm biased, but I think the universities and the students that we bring in have a disproportionate impact, not just in the short term, but in the long term to Scotland's economy. So yes, they might not be paying a few £100 a month on council tax, but they're certainly spending a heck of a lot more that wouldn't be here if we didn't have the students coming in. And a lot of them do stay, and that generates long-term stuff. And if we turn out graduates with average salaries of £30,000 from Edinburgh University, then that's quite a lot of income tax that is flowing into Mr. Mackay's coffers. So I think we can probably give students a bit of a break on council tax for just now. I think the point about tourism, there's big questions about the Edinburgh economy and how the sustainable growth in there. And what's quite extraordinary about it is actually coming back to the point about the difference of populations across Scotland is actually the difference performance of economics across Scotland. And Edinburgh doing, amazingly successfully, strong growth over the last, ever since the financial crisis. And other parts of the economy trying to keep up with that. And Edinburgh's the closest we've got to a London type economy in Scotland. And that is something which should be very welcome. It's dynamic, it's strong growth, it's creating lots of opportunities. Yes, it has challenges, so sustainability and the pace of growth and where investment goes into it. But I think it's something, it's a nicer problem to have than a world where an economy is growing more slowly. Tourism is a particular issue, and I know that the government are looking at that around, potential a transient visitor levy. I'm not allowed to use tax, a transient visitor levy, which is potentially reinvested in local. But I don't think the growth in Edinburgh is purely just linked to tourism. And if you look at what's happening in financial services, asset management, professional services, government-related activities, it's much more broad-based than it just being based in tourism. But I do think there are issues there, which I think everyone's aware of, but it's just, can you turn the investment around in time to cope with that demand?
So we've got two questions, one at the back there and the gentleman here. So the back goes
can I just ask, there's already evidence that since June 2016, that a lot of EU migrants are returning home. They're going back to their country of origin, notably Poles. I think there's a huge tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Poles who return home. How much is Scotland affected by this kind of thing? Do we know? Is there any evidence? And what impact does it have on do we know already what impact it has on skill shortages and in what particular sectors? I think that's one for you, Graeme.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And to build on the discussion about council tax, has the time come to start thinking about a tax policy that differentiates between different age groups? And what role might land tax have to play in some of the specific issues that were raised earlier about local circumstances and local needs?
Okay, so on the EU migration point since 2016, so there's, as you mentioned, there's evidence at the UK level about that potentially having people returning and moving back. And interestingly, I think the subtle point about that, and just coming back to the point about the volatility in that, how much of that is driven by the actual Brexit vote, or how much is driven by the collapse in sterling that happened afterwards? Yes. So it's now much less attractive to work in the UK than it has been in the past. So I think that for me, with a pure economics hat on, that's probably the biggest driver that you've seen about why people are changing their behaviours around all of that. From a particular Scottish perspective, I mean, at least we hear anecdotal stuff. I'm not entirely sure about what we've seen in terms of the raw evidence yet, because a lot of this stuff is still modelled and projected and how much we've actually got. But if you look at anecdotal stuff around what's been happening in some of the skill shortages in the agricultural sector, particularly this summer, there's at least some anecdotal evidence that it's potentially having had an impact. And one of the interesting reflections from a university sector about it, what we've seen is not so much people leaving, so academic members of staff or whatever, or researchers leaving to go back to Europe. More about the conversations you're having about attracting people to the UK are slightly more nuanced than perhaps have been in the past. And people are, actively probing about what their future status might be, what the attractiveness of the UK might be as a base for collaboration, research, etc. So I think that, for me, is more of the issue that will be to look at in the future, is what's the lost opportunity rather than what's the actual cost of people leaving. It's the unknown, that potentially have been missed. Do you want me to pick up the tax? Can I just
follow on that one? I mean, I think you have to be terribly careful actually with what you do with net migration figures. I mean, remember that net migration figures are the result of great big numbers, and you take one from another and you get that. And particularly, a lot of the migration figures, remember, particularly for Scotland, are based on really pretty dicey statistical bases. Indeed, I mean, so dicey statistical bases that some of them have actually been removed from being official statistics at the moment until they can actually be improved. So I think simply commenting on what these statistics may or may not show in 1 year, I think is still a very risky thing. And again, you do have to differentiate very markedly between people not coming and the net figure, which is the difference between people coming and people going. And I think that whole difficulty is that whole issue is very, very, very difficult to talk about on an immediate 1 year or even 2 year basis.
Do you want to do the tax?
Do you want to deal with that?
Do you want to do the tax one?
Yeah.
So, yeah, obviously, so one of the interesting things again about what's happened over the last few years is that obviously there's significant variation within different age brackets about how people are being taxed and how well off, etc. they are. But actually, if you look at the evidence since 2010, since the austerity period happened, the one age group in the population that have done relatively better than everybody else are the people who are older because of the things like the triple lock protection and so on. And that's not to say that's a bad thing, but actually, out of everyone who's kind of shared the burden around tackling the deficit, that's been less on the older population. I think one of the really interesting questions is over time, how do you potentially think about what the future of your tax system might be if you're going to have to significantly raise income tax or some form of tax in order to meet these demands? And actually, income tax is probably one of the worst taxes you might want to do that, given it's all about incentivizing behavior, and actually exploring, properly ideas around wealth taxes, about land value taxes, where you could raise significantly more revenue with a less distortive impact on the economy than you would do with ramping up income taxes, is something which, again, this discussion about how we fund public services in the future, I think we need to get. Just adding on pennies and thresholds to income tax will help you in the short run, but in the long run, it needs a much broader conversation about how you fund that, which for Scotland opens up some really interesting questions about whether we actually have the levers to do that, because we're constrained largely on income tax, and the incentive then to keep on raising income tax to pay for higher costs or higher investment in the health service, again, that might not be an optimal way if you're looking at it, how you would fund public services over the long run.
Two questions over here.
Hi, both. Thank you very much. I'm looking at the slide that says deja vu, so I'm going to ask Graeme to do a bit of sort of future casting here and think about the future of work and what role that plays in helping to drive productivity to grow the economy. And just wonder if you have a sense of how good Scotland is at adopting technology. I'm thinking about the future of AI and machine learning. But actually, I'm thinking about the adoption of existing technology and whether or not you think Scotland is in a strong place across its business base to take advantage of existing technology.
Yeah, I attended a public meeting in a packed hall in Ullapool this summer where a well-known politician waved a copy of your book, Michael, urging everybody to go and buy a copy. Now, at £80 a throw, it's a wee bit steep. I'm just wondering if what you've got to say is incredibly important, and is there a way of getting your key messages about Scotland's population to Scotland's population?
I mean, I guess I deal with that one first because it's a very, very easy one. Yes, I would love, for example, it to be priced more cheaply. I'm somewhat constrained, unfortunately, about producing, as it were, a quick popular version by the restrictive nature of the contract that you sign when you actually write a book like that. Some of the stuff that I wrote that I was talking about on migration is actually in the Registrar General's annual review for, I think it's 2015, where I was actually given a chapter to write in that. But other than that, I'm sure if people asked me to write say article type things for things, yes, I would do it. Technology, Graeme.
I'd also add, I work for National Records of Scotland, so we produce most of the statistics that have been shown here tonight, and they're all freely available on our website. We're doing a lot more in terms of infographics, so the booklet, Scotland's Population, that some of you picked up, that's one of the ways that we're trying to reach a wider audience. We have interactive visualizations, so you can look at like migration rates in your council area and like population structure in your neighbourhood level and things like that. So we are doing a lot to try to reach a wider audience.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Very much better. And very much better than the Office of National Statistics website as well, I have to say.
So, Graeme, do you want to take the future of work?
I can do, yeah. I'm just amazed. £80 for it. We won't get £80 for it because we're having the wrong game.
As somebody pointed out, it's actually only 20p a page. Because it is actually almost 500 pages long.
Yeah, I mean, it's a brilliant question. And I think that's where there's massive opportunities to think about how we can turn these demographic challenges into an opportunity over time, but not only just to improve the economy, but actually to, what's this all about? It's about improving well-being and improving people's lives. So how can you generally turn that into something which you create opportunities from all of that? I mean, I think big questions for me about generally capturing, flexible working. So we're, again, the kids that we have coming through university, they don't want to work 9 to 5, 5 days a week. So they're not wanting to do it. So the world of work will change because they are now demanding a completely different way of operating. So how do we think about it through the entire work program, but also particularly when people are, coming towards retirement, how we can continue for them to significantly engage in the workforce and to show that leadership and management and experience that really matters to our economy. So there's something in there about thinking really creatively and important about that. I think skills and education is absolutely crucial. In the past, it was always the way that you were educated. You went to university, education got you a skill. That skill then was your job, and then you had that for 50 years, and that's completely broken now. So there's big questions there about how we skill people. Massive questions for universities about what's the role of a university in creating the next generation of work. How open are we to encouraging people of all ages to come in and learn? How flexible are we to come in and support skills development that's not, we'll sell you a 4-year degree, and actually much more about a continuous learning and engagement opportunity there. And we've got world-class universities, so there's a big opportunity in all of that. And then the point you make about adopting technology is really crucial and really subtle. And a lot of the times when we talk about things like R&D, we couple it together and we do R&D as though it's one thing, and it's not. And if you actually look at all the information, all the data, the UK and Scotland are brilliant in research, and we're crap, pardon my language, on development. It's that ability to turn the research into meaningful outputs, but crucially, then be able to disseminate and have that development to be used across the board. I mean, if you still look at things like skills and management in core businesses, it's that bit which lags behind. Simple process innovation, ability to use websites, ability to access information and take changes that are needed. That is a massive opportunity, because if we get that right, then we can help tackle some of these challenges.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Unfortunately, I know there's still more questions, but we've come to the end of formal questions. I hope Mike and Graeme will be around for a little bit afterwards for anyone that wants to ask them informally. I will follow up afterwards with the link to Esther's research page, or the National Records of Scotland's data page that we mentioned, and also the link to the last event. The sound from tonight, it's all been recorded. Sorry, I didn't mention that before. I don't think anyone said anything they shouldn't. So if you know people that weren't here tonight and you think would benefit from hearing it, please do pass it on and share it. I think it really is important that more people are aware of the challenges and the data change that we are having in Scotland and how we are affected differently from the rest of the UK. So I'd like to thank both the speakers for your contributions. It's been really important and lots of food for thought for all of us. I'd like to also thank the audience because, as always, you have great conversations, great questions, and always cause lots more thought in everyone's heads. As you know, the David Hume Institute is a charity. We're entirely funded by donations, and we brought this event to you free of charge tonight. So please do consider supporting us if ever you're making charitable donations. I would also, we haven't in the past asked for feedback from events. So tomorrow morning in your inboxes, you'll have a very short survey. It'll take less than 2 minutes. Please do click the link and take a few moments to tell us what you think of it. What do you want us to continue doing? What would be useful issues for you to hear next year? Is it the right venue? Is it the right time? All those things we want to know. And if you don't tell us, we won't know it. So please do tell us. Please don't be shy. Tonight, if you want to tell us anything directly, Sarah and I are here to listen. John, our chair, is also at the front. Please do have a conversation with us. David Hume Institute is all about conversations, and we want to hear from you. So it just brings me now to say thank you in the formal way to everyone here tonight.